of the opinion that our time sitting here in the church today should be reasonably brief. We have some things that need to be said today, some things to remember and reflect about, and some talk about what comes next. But I think what we're really about here today is to spend the time together in celebration. And plus, we got that barbecue going. So, we're going to be here for a little bit, but we've blocked out 2 hours, and I know I don't want to be here for 2 hours. So we'll do what we need to do, and then we'll continue outside around tables. But let me say a few things. Many of you have spoken to me over the last 6 months, whatever it is, during Indaba, about your experience of it. And I know that there have been some mixed experiences. Some people have had some concerns along the way. But overwhelmingly, the response to this Indaba process, or Indaba experience, has been extraordinarily positive. I'm so glad about that. This was sort of my first thing to lay on the table when I became bishop. And I knew that there were some risks inherent in it. And I think we're going to keep doing this. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But there are some things we can learn from this. When we introduced this and began to talk about Indaba and put the information out, a whole lot of people came back to us with questions, kind of questioning the structure of what we were going to do. So we would get questions like, why can't we just do this on an evening around dinner? Do we really need to go for a weekend? Why do we have to stay in people's houses? These kind of questions. And so some clergy and people got back to us and said, I'm sorry, the commitment is just too high. I actually don't think the commitment was too high. People are busy, but whenever someone says, I'm too busy to do something, all that means that there's something else that they put as a higher priority. And I think that... I think, you can tell me better, that I think that at the end of this 6 months, you all would say, this was a high priority.
Yes.
So, we wound up with just under a third of our churches participating in the Indaba. Now, there were people who saw that and thought that was extremely disappointing. Why is everybody not in it? I will tell you that I was very pleased with that. We launched something, people didn't know what Indaba meant, it seemed like a big commitment, they weren't sure why we were doing it, they didn't understand it, and yet a third of our churches said we want to be part of this. So I saw that as a very, very positive thing. What's happened since is that you all have talked about it, and people have heard that. So we're hearing back now from churches who are kind of jealous. We feel very sorry for them. They're kind of jealous that something that they didn't really know what it was going to be about, and maybe we need to take some responsibility for that, but that they really didn't get, decided not to be part of, turned out to be really powerful, and people had, in some cases, life-changing experiences, and they're sort of feeling like, I wish we had done that. And they will get a chance. But what we began to see, what I began to hear from people like Michael Rebick and others who work with people through diocesan staff, is that they're coming back and saying, even churches that are not participating in Indaba have changed the way they are talking about their life because of it. So something is happening in the diocese through the relationships that we're building. I have seen, just to sort of scan through, and I'll spend more time with it later, the evaluative things that you all filled out, the sort of how did it go, questions about it. And in there, I'm seeing some things we can learn from. But mostly what I'm seeing is this was outstanding. This was excellent. We really loved it. And exactly what I hoped and prayed would happen as a result of this, which was people from across the diocese who would maybe not otherwise ever have a reason to pass through the door of one another's churches, spent considerable time together in a deep way, and will never be the same again in the way they think about the Diocese of New York. That's all I ever wanted, and that's what we got out of this. Some of the things that we learned, there were so many questions at the beginning, why can't we do it a different way? Why does it have to be like this? That we got kind of rigid about the rules. And, you know, so... I don't apologize for that. Because if we hadn't, this whole thing would have been so chaotic. And some groups would have had one kind of experience, and some groups would have had a different kind of experience, and some would have just done it over dinner or in one evening. And we needed to say, you do have to stay with other people. You do have to go for the weekend. This really is the way this is going to work. But I think that maybe going forward, we can learn a few things like, boy, was it a mistake to schedule this on the weekend of the priest conference. We didn't mean to do that. But, you know, things like that. And groups that said, can we shift this one week? We're all in agreement. And maybe, you know, maybe there was no reason why that couldn't happen. And so I think as we do Indaba going forward, I will certainly want to have us look and be a little bit more flexible with it, particularly in terms of people who have already done Indaba. I think going into it as a new thing, we needed to say, this is the program, this is how it works. So I think the reflection I would make today about what has happened and what I have heard from you and what I've read in your evaluations is that there are some ways we could have made this a little bit better or maybe a little friendlier in some of the structures of it. But overwhelmingly the experience was positive. People have been changed by it and they are excited to come from this and see what happens next. Is that a fair assessment of where we are today?
Yes.
All right. In a little bit, we're going to have a little time for Q&A, and we can get more specific about some of it. But let me talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing next. The number of churches that did not participate in this Indaba who want to participate in Indaba is so high that I think that what I want to do, at least for the foreseeable future, and until such a time that we realize we don't need to do this anymore, is that we will begin offering this very Indaba experience annually in the Diocese of New York. Now, for churches that have not participated, this will be the way in. For you all that have, it is also an opportunity for you to do it again. You'll be repartnered up with other churches. If you now have 2 other churches in the diocese that are your best friends, why not have 2 more? So this coming fall, we will give everyone an opportunity to re-up or to come new into another Indaba experience of this kind, which we will do during 2015. In the fall of 2015, we will plan for the 2016 Indaba and continue to build and deepen these relationships across the diocese. In the meantime, you do have relationships with 2 other churches that you love. Do whatever you want with it. You know, I mean that. You know, we didn't come into this and think, and then when we get to the end of Indaba, you know, we will then impose a new structure on it, or this is what we expect to happen after that. Some of you may say, this was great, we're going to move on from it. Some of you may say, we want to continue a partnership with these churches in the short and maybe even long-term life of our church. You are welcome to do so. You have friends now, stay friendly. Take this and do whatever makes sense for you and your community and your church with it. But we're going to go forward, and in a little bit you're going to hear about 2 ways that we're going to continue Indaba conversations that are really structured around some conversations that need to take place. And we're going to begin that very, very shortly. Today you'll have an introduction to it, and then immediately we're going to have a letter out to the diocese. Well, let me talk about that now, I guess. When I first began talking about this, I noted that we have some very, very serious work to do in the Diocese of New York. The man who made our barbecue today also heads the budget committee of the diocese. And Matt and I and a couple other folks met this week to talk about the revised budget for 2014 as we look at the last half of the year as a way of beginning to talk about the 2015 budget. And it's grim. You know, in 2009, we were coming out of the historic economic collapse in America, and everybody needed relief. And we brought relief around assessments at the 2009 convention. We restructured the assessment formula. Now I'm going to say something that many of you will not agree with. we made a mistake. We should have made immediate reductions in assessment, annually reviewable. Instead, we made a permanent change to the assessment formula. I don't see us turning that around right away. But what it means is the Diocese of New York is now, will continue to be a hand-to-mouth operation. And one of the things that we're beginning to look at is how we get away from the long-term pattern of significant support of operating budgets of small, poor, and struggling congregations to begin to develop models of local self-sufficiency. We have to do that because we no longer have the money to provide the kind of assistance to bring those resources that we did in the past. We're putting... Is that clapping for fewer resources? or clapping? It's, you know, and it can be for both, because quite frankly, this is really complicated. Everybody did need assessment relief, still do. Most of our churches are not able to pay their assessment in full. We have economic, financial struggle all over the diocese in 2/3 of our parishes easily, and we need to respect that and provide help to churches to meet operating expenses and go forward. But in the meantime, we have a question that's going to become increasingly urgent. Should we be a diocese of 200 churches or 100 churches? And part of the reason for having the Indaba conversations and developing these relationships was so that when we begin to talk about issues, yes, of assessment, of church planting, of mission, of our common life, you will have sat down at each other's dinner tables. And you will be able to come into those conversations knowing something about the churches in the diocese who will be affected, every church will be affected, by the decisions that we make. So when we sit to begin to look at budget conversations, things that have to happen in terms of the way that we budget and spend the money of the diocese, we have very, very little available to us. And out of that, I've begun to talk about things like we need to spend time talking about and defining the marks of a healthy congregation. I have also said that we need to come to a place where we can talk about and identify what it means to be an imperiled congregation or a distressed congregation. And I know that my talking about those things has ratcheted up the anxiety level in the diocese as high as it can be. People worry. What would it mean to be an imperiled congregation? What comes out of these conversations? We talk about health. But what I want to say is this. Most of our churches are no longer sustainable as they are. The financial demands and challenges for most of our churches are so high that when we look at the diocese as we see it now, the one thing that we can say with absolute confidence is it will look different in 10 years. Now, what that difference will be, I don't know. A lot of people are worried that we're beginning to take steps that at a certain point will turn into we're going to close your church. And that's not what this is about. When we do develop a canon, some principles around imperiled congregations, there will not be in that power given to the bishop or anyone else to close a church that doesn't want to be closed. What we are about is helping. And I think one of the things that worries me about that anxiety is it suggests that the diocese, the bishop, the diocese, the larger structures of the church have perhaps earned or deserved being viewed with suspicion. That when the diocese comes calling, it's going to be bad news. Well, I don't have any desire to be bishop of a diocese in that kind of model. What I want us to be about is helping one another and going forward together so that we can define and then live into health together. So Indaba is part of the beginning of that we develop long, deep commitments to one another and a broader understanding of the life of the whole diocese. When I read your comments, many of them in the evaluative things that came out, a lot of that is what you talked about. Being in places that you'd never been before, meeting people you'd never met before, seeing the way the church functions and operates in settings that were completely foreign to you. This kind of knowledge is what we need going forward so that we do not find ourselves in the position we could get to, where we are all in competition with one another for what we perceive to be a shrinking well of resources. If we do that, then we're not going to be the church anymore. and it doesn't matter if we can save it. So this is the beginning of working toward a different way of being together, different kind of conversation, and a different way of talking about health. And in places, unhealth, and where we see unhealth, how we can help. So one of the things I said at the beginning is that when we go from this into conversations that will lead into strategic planning, at the beginning, I said that in order to be part of those conversations, you would need to have participated in Indaba. I still mean it. I have to make a nuance in it. Only a third of our churches are part of Indaba. And in order for us to have conversations about these larger issues of mission and money and structure, and have buy-in across the diocese, we need to have participation across the diocese. So we're beginning to develop a structure for the Indaba conversations that will begin shortly around marks of a healthy congregation. Indaba conversations will involve clergy and will involve lay leaders of parishes in a way that brings leadership for the conversations from you, but broader participation and invitation to the whole diocese. So there will be a place for you all to begin and lead the conversations that are to come, because the only way we can have these conversations is if there are people in the room who know and have seen and have lived with people who minister and live in very, very different contexts in the Diocese of New York. So in a little bit, the Archdeacon is going to talk about these conversations that we're going to begin to roll out very shortly. And in that, we're going to invite participation by all the churches. But we will begin with the first priority for participants will be those people who have been part of this Indaba. Then we begin to roll that out farther into people who are delegates to convention and then to others and involve a broader community in the conversation. But this is the next step that we're going to be going into. And that will begin very, very shortly. We won't be spending weekends with each other, but we will be spending time in places across the diocese together in conversation with people who minister and live in contexts different than we do, so that when we talk about what health is, we will see that there's not just one model of congregational health. You know, at the priest conference, Father Yesupatham Duraikanu, took me a while to learn how to pronounce his name. I can spell Yesupatham, but not Duraikanu. But Father Yesu got up during a Q&A and talked about supplying on a couple of Sundays at St. Andrew's in South Fallsburg. And he noted that there were only 7 people there. And so he kind of raised that up in kind of the light of what do we do about this? But my response to that was to say, well, I was there not long ago, there were 12 people there. You know, the bishops come and you got to have a potluck, so you know, we gather. We got the Christmas and Easter crowd, so there were 12 people. But here's the thing: they have an unbelievable feeding ministry out of the undercroft of that church. They are up in the Catskills. They are surrounded by Hasidic Jews, Roman Catholics, fundamentalists and Pentecostals, and then there's this little group of 12 Episcopalians. They're feeding all the hungry people. And they're beginning to reach out to a community of people up there that nobody else is paying attention to yet, which is the growing Latino population around South Fallsburg. That's a definition of health. Okay? But it doesn't necessarily look like that if we think just in conventional terms. But you all have seen it, and you know. So you bring the wisdom that we need when we have these conversations. And those are the next conversations that we will have. Feels like there was something else I wanted to talk about, but I should have written it down. So maybe at this point, let me hear some of your questions or comments you'd like to make about your experience, and then we'll sort of take it from there. If you have anything you want to say or anything you want to ask. I don't see.
Come up high.
Oh, up in the balcony. Yes.
I think God has led us to such a wonderful place that now we have to do what we should have been doing all along, which is reaching out in friendship. It is simply no longer possible, thanks be to God, to be a Lone Ranger anymore. We have to be a community, and we want to be a community. We've got bunches of 3 parishes that have only been on 3 dates want to get married now. What they really want is a ménage à trois, and you can do that. So the question becomes not how do we do like congregational ministry throughout the diocese, but how do we do community ministry throughout the diocese with each other, not borrowing good ideas, but always asking the question, how can we do that together, like South Paulsburg? It's like, how can we 7 people, which is God's number of completeness, 412, which is really complete, minister together rather than support 12 little ministries? So, you know, the Lord has led us safe thus far, and the Lord will lead us home. So I'm looking forward to this. Good.
Yeah. You know, we have 200 churches now. I don't know how long I'll be bishop. I never look both ways when I cross the street, so it may not be very long. But when our daughters were little, Margaret took them aside one day and said, "Never follow your father into the street." but we have 200 churches now, and for the next decade anyway. I expect I'll be the Bishop of New York. When we get to the end of that time, I will have more than 200 churches. But certainly staying with 200, keeping our footprint on the ground, making the places where we are vibrant, deep wells of spiritual witness to the love of God for all people would be what I want to have happen. And we're going to spend these years developing structures to support that everywhere we are. There may be some places where we're going to have to rethink the way that we make our presence in certain communities or places. But we begin with the presumption and the understanding that there is no place where we are that cannot be a healthy witness to God. So that's where we're starting. And that's what I mean when I say, when you see the diocese coming, I hope we're coming to help. That we want to have those kind of conversations, and we're going to have them in partnership with surrounding churches regionally, and ask the question, what should and can the Episcopal presence look like in this area? Not so much by siloing every congregation and saying, what are we going to do about this church? Talking about that for 10 hours and saying, okay, well, what are we going to do about this church? But instead saying, what can we be together in the places where we are? And I realize that's a very different kind of conversation than we would have in a place like, say, Manhattan. But when we get out of the city and we get out into places where ministry is really hard, and the challenge is, not that it's not hard in the city, right? Oh my God. But when we get out into places where the resources are very reduced, and everybody's dealing with significant decline, not just of their churches, but in many places of their towns, we have to have a different kind of conversation. And that's what we're beginning to talk about. Now, ultimately, this means also involving and talking about it in ways appropriate to places in the Bronx, Staten Island, and Manhattan as well. And some of these conversations are beginning on Staten Island. And I've been meeting with some of the clergy in the South Bronx now for a year and a half, going on a couple of years, and we're beginning to have conversations about a plan for collaborative ministry across the 10 churches of the South Bronx. So it's not just rural, but in different ways in different places. These conversations are beginning, but the thing that they all have in common is together. How do we do this together? Someone asked me what we're going to do in Harlem, and I said we have challenges in Harlem, but what we're going to do is we're going to lift all those churches together, because dealing with them one-on-one isn't working for us. But getting all the clergy together and the people together and talking as a community is actually starting to get some traction. So, yeah. Yes?
And I want to thank you. This was a gutsy thing to do. It was not an easy decision to try and pull this off. And for us personally in the group that we had, it's been fantastic.
Right.
I want to thank you for that. One of the things that I wanted to know was, when you looked at these elements, I've always felt for a while that it's a growth issue in the diocese as opposed to a cutting issue. And from the synopsis that you've read, what are the conclusions or some of the preliminary things that you've come up with as to how we grow in a better way than what we have in the past? We've done it piecemeal, but what strategic direction are you thinking as to how we would take it to the next level?
I need to ask you a clarifying question. What do you mean by growth?
Expand the number of people in the seats so that we can grow our way to a higher revenue base.
Okay. three-part plan for that. When I was a candidate for bishop, the most common question I got was, how can we grow our churches? And I decided that if I couldn't tell the truth as an answer to that question, then I probably shouldn't be doing this at all. And my answer was, if we had any idea how to grow the church, we would have done it already. Now, that's not meant to be flip, because actually it's true.
But there must have been some conclusions that came from our process.
Yeah, now let me talk about that. When you look at, I can never remember his name, Hollowell or something. He's the statistician for the Episcopal Church, periodically puts out a state of the church.
Kirk
Hadaway, yeah. When he puts out his statistics about the number of people in the church, the statistics around our growth, where growth is happening, where growth isn't happening, one of the things he observes is that, we have 1/3 of our churches are growing in the Diocese of New York. And that means that 2/3 of our churches are either sort of hanging in or declining, but they're not growing. Now, when you look at the churches that are growing, they're not randomly scattered across the map. And one of the things that Hadaway says is that when you look at growth in the church, there's some absolute patterns that are almost inviolable. They're just across the board. In large metropolitan areas, the church is growing. All right? In Manhattan, we have a lot of growth happening in many of our churches. In newer and more affluent suburbs and exurbs, the church is growing. In older suburbs, the church is declining. In small towns and rural areas, the church is declining. And if you take his observations and you apply them to a map of the Diocese of New York, it's just virtually exactly accurate to our experience. Which means that when we talk about growth, we're going to talk about it in different ways in different parts of the diocese. And so a church that, say, in Manhattan, that is working hard to respond to and to address the positive demographics that may be about them, and they're experiencing growth because of that. This is a great thing, but we can't necessarily turn from that and go to that church and say, why aren't you doing the same thing? When that church is in a town that's lost 10% of its population in the last 5 years, young people are moving away in droves, people go to college, you never see them again, and the town is wondering if it's going to survive. So inside the town, so are all the churches, asking the same question. So when we talk about growth in some of those places, we know that we're not necessarily talking about the kind of numerical growth that we would find in other places. So when we begin to talk about regional pastorates, coming together, working together, what we're focused on there is developing structures of local self-sufficiency to prepare a platform for doing mission together in the area. I will say, and I don't think there's any church in the Diocese of New York that cannot attract new people into it. But largely, in many places, they're replacing the ones who died or moved to Florida. Or, increasingly in this world, decided that the church is not a place to get their spiritual needs met, and wandered away. So, for a whole lot of our churches that are hanging in there, remaining reasonably stable, in a context which is profoundly unstable, keeping the same or similar numbers actually is growth. So, when we talk about growth, it's very, very complicated. We have to, as I said, talk about it in different ways, in different vocabulary, in different parts of the diocese. But let me make a couple of statements about this, and to touch on one thing that you said, expand the numbers of people in the pews so that we can increase the revenues. When we expand the number of people in the pews, or when we just take the folks who are there, and we begin to engage in really serious, faithful ways, the call to Christian stewardship that every Christian is given, that can raise revenues. We have plenty of places in churches large and small where there are really serious challenges to meet around stewardship. So that is attached to growth, but it's a separate spiritual question next to the one about growth. And then finally, let me say that I think we're probably about 40 years into the latest period of church decline. I think we've kind of bottomed out on that, but we've been dropping numbers since the 70s. So we've been talking about growth in kind of urgent ways for about 4 decades. How are we going to grow the church? How are we going to grow the church? And what I want to say is that, in my opinion, that single-minded growth consciousness is a heresy that's killing the church. That does not mean that numbers aren't important. But they're not important so that we can sustain the institution. They're important because God loves everybody. So we have to pay attention to numbers. But what we have found ourselves in for 40 years is talking about growth solely for the sake of growing. And often that turns into, and I don't want to pick on the statements you made by any means, but because it creates greater revenues. And what I want to say today is that while we do want to pay attention to numbers and we need to think about growth as part of our larger life in the church, growth as a goal in itself is a heresy because it implies and it suggests that we believe that the church can be built like any other kind of institution by the same strategies that other institutions might use.
That's right. That's right.
Your parishes are not branch franchise operations of some big monolithic institution called the Diocese of New York. They are centers of Christian ministry and places, when we're doing it right, where all the world can see our witness to what we know and believe and guides our lives, that God loves us through Christ and we love other people because we've been loved.
Amen.
Now, this is growth of us. And I believe that when we become focused, not single-minded focus on growth in numbers, but single-minded focus on the mission and ministry that God has laid in front of us right now, on the day He's given us, in the place He's put us. If we do that right, and people can see that, we probably will get numerical growth. That people, I don't believe there's anyone anywhere that doesn't have spiritual needs and does not desire to find a way and a place to have those met. You know, driving around in New York City, you pass these apartment buildings, there's probably 10,000 people in New York. I don't know, there's so many windows. You know, you drive, there's just, you know, people, millions of people. And most of them are not in church. And I think about them as I look at their windows, and I think about how many nights I lie awake. Wake up. Worst thing in the world is to wake up at 4 in the morning because you know you're done. If you wake up at 2, you got a chance of falling asleep. You know, you made me the Bishop of New York and gave me something else to think about in the middle of the night. But sometimes I wake up and I'm worried about my daughters. Sometimes I wake up and I'm worried about my cholesterol or whatever it might be. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I feel lonely. My life isn't working for me the way I want it to. I wake up in the middle of the night, the stranger lying next to me, I love so dearly. All those kind of questions that come to us, wake us up. All the people that I have neglected and hurt in my life to come back to visit me at 2:30. Stand around the bed and point at me. I think about all the people out there who are behind those windows, who are not in church, who are also awake at 2:30, who also have spiritual needs to be met. And I wonder if Jesus could help those situations. And when I think about that, I think about the fact that we have a responsibility to them. So I'm not so much worried about how we grow the church so we can keep the church going. I do worry about whether or not, as the church, we are providing the spiritual resource and the outreach to the people around us who are dying for lack of it. And that's what I mean by growth. And if we stay focused on the mission and the ministry, other people will find us irresistible. and they will come in. And then, as a piece of that, the revenues will go up too. But I don't want to start with that as our goal. I want to start by having us try to be Jesus as best we can be, and then seeing what comes out of that. I mean, Jesus started off, he didn't have any people around him, but ultimately he wound up with, one of the biggest religions in the world. So, well, let's focus on the ministry and then see where it goes. Eric.
First of all, Bishop, I just have to say, it's such a breath of fresh air. I could grab that person, and I would say, I need you to not be driving by. I need you to be sitting in here at an hour on a Sunday morning, so that you can pay for what we're doing. What would be if assuming the person just didn't run as fast as they could, what would they say? They would say, what are you doing? So the question is always going to be, what are you doing? Not how do we get the money to do it? So
Eric, and I feel like I picked on your question. I don't mean to do that. But it's because it's all together.
Yeah.
These issues, we can talk about many, many different things, but if we're not tending to the health of the institution, then we're not going to be around much longer. I think that's what you were getting at. And so this is all tied together, but let's go to the person who's driving by Divine Love. A great name for a church, by the way. Surprised you don't have more of them. But let's talk about that person driving by Divine Love. You got two ways. They stop at the stop line and you run out to their window and you can say, we need you to come and sit in our pew on Sunday morning so that you can support our Buildings and Grounds Committee. But let's say that you decide not to do that, Eric. What do you say when you get to the window of the car? All right? That's the question that we need to wrestle with.
Yeah.
We haven't actually been running out to the windows of those cars, but we need to think about what we would say when we get there. Because in some way or another, we are communicating our priorities and what we believe about God already. Now, there are a whole lot of people who would look at us, no longer believing that the Episcopal Church is a place to get their spiritual needs met, and see that the message we're communicating is that God is dead. Pardon me?
Because we do that very well.
Yeah. It's, we write mission statements for our churches. We're already saying something about our mission all the time. We say it in the things that we do beautifully well, and we say it in the things that we do terribly badly. One of the things that we have to do before, I used to say, when I talk about stewardship in my parish, before we can talk about about our stewardship goals, we need to stop doing the things that are impediments to stewardship. Before we can talk about, our call to outreach and to ministry and spiritual formation, we need to stop doing the things that are impeding that kind of life. And so we need to pay attention to the things that we communicate to the world around us, and some of it we don't know we're communicating, and it's messages we don't want to give. Which means that when we get to the window of that car, that'll now be the metaphor. When we run out into the street and we get to the driver's window of that car, this is the metaphor for evangelism. What are we going to say to that person? And if we don't know the answer to that, well then let's say that that's our question. As we get together to talk about marks of healthy church, what we mean when we say that sometimes in some places we're imperiled, when we think about our mission and ministry going forward. The only thing I want to say is, we have not been called into being by God so that we may create and preserve an institutional structure, unless that institutional structure has as its sole priority in life the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the service of Jesus' brothers and sisters, God's sons and daughters. If we are really making a witness to the love of God through Jesus Christ for all people, that's the reason the church should exist. If we're not doing that, then this is a whole lot of energy around something that doesn't matter much. What I would suggest is that what's happened in Indaba is you have been able to see through the eyes of others who have come to your house the ways that you're making that witness that you may not have known. And we're learning from each other and about each other things that are important for what it means for us to be church together. And that's what we have to do and what we need in order to go forward and have, yes, the institutional conversations and questions as well. You've been trying to get a question in edgewise for a long time.
Bishop, I just want to say say that I've been a member of the Episcopal Church for about 20 years. And I always, in that time, I had the idea as a Latino woman that the Episcopal Church was something like unreachable to us Latinos.
Was what?
Unreachable. In the sense that,
Oh, unreachable.
unreachable. In the sense that we were Latinos worshiping in one place, but there was no way of connecting to the African Americans or the white churches. Now with Indaba, when we saw this, I said, well, now I'm going to visit the yuppies from downtown, the rich and famous from upstate. And, you know, when I went to each one of these houses and I met people, I mean, there were not the yuppies or the rich and famous. I mean, I saw that we can talk, you know, we were communicating, and I loved so much the experience. Now, my question is this. I am a professional, U.S. citizen, very outspoken woman, and I really get into things. As a Latina woman, my concern is, how are the other Latinos who are members of this church, who don't have all the privileges that I supposedly have, how do they really see their church? How is their church opening up to these other members? Because I still don't see it.
I don't know. I am not Latino. I cannot tell you how the Latinos in our churches view the larger church. What I can say is we have a number of Spanish-speaking congregations. Some of them are extraordinarily healthy places and churches. Across our Latino population in the church, we're about 2/3 undocumented. So a person who is in one of our churches who is undocumented is not the professional U.S. citizen, outspoken person that you are, because they can't be outspoken and they can't become a citizen. So we have a huge ministry to people who, for reasons that have nothing to do with the church, but the larger society around us, have to live somewhat in the shadows. Now what I'll say about that is that when you go to these churches, you find vibrant, lively, missional places of service and celebration. The churches are for people who cannot be as public as you or I. They are functioning as places where they can have an experience of God, where they can have service to one another, where they can grow in Christ, and they are profoundly loyal to their churches and happy to be in them. Now, let me say something about that. Year and a half ago or so, I don't know when it was, Carla Guzman had a meeting of Latino clergy, and I came to it. And she had Anthony Guillen at the meeting, who is the, I don't know what his title is, but Hispanic Latina officer for the Church Center. And I had my eyes opened. I had put in front of me the evidence of a way that we have been articulating our mission around Latino ministry that is all backwards, or at least it's not complete. We have, in this diocese, and I think this is true in most dioceses, we have created as our understanding of and our priority for Latino ministry a call to minister to very recent immigrant, monolingual, Spanish, impoverished people. Now what that means is that when we start a congregation, and that's what makes up that congregation, the entire cost of operating that church needs to be paid for by the rest of us and gets paid for through our assessment budget. We have a line item for paying the salaries of Hispanic clergy in some of those churches right now, and we are $100,000 over budget. We have a second line item to provide money for programming in those churches. It's $87,000 in the line item for the many churches that we have, and it goes to pay tiny little minuscule grants for little programs across those churches. So we're not funding what we need to do in Latino ministry and Hispanic ministry. But what Anthony came to say is that 2/3 of the Latina people in the United States are as you are. Second or third generation Americans, fully English-speaking, professionals, educated, most of them citizens, living in full participation in the larger life. We haven't paid any attention to that. And so you'll hear, this is coming out in the coming week, an announcement about a workshop that Anthony will be leading in the Diocese of New York at the end of June. There'll be 2 more in the fall, so that we can begin to get a common conversation across the diocese about the way that we engage ministry to Spanish-speaking people and to English-speaking people of Hispanic background. We're going to start doing it differently, and we need to find ways to help all of our congregations begin to embrace and welcome in the full community. You know, I have my great-grandfather, Oscar Dietsche, came to the New World. He didn't speak any English, and settled in Buffalo, New York. And then Herb Dietsche, my grandfather, was born in Buffalo, and he went to school in German until he was in middle school and then switched to English. And then my dad, Raymond Dietsche, never learned any German in his life. But when those folks showed up, they didn't start a German church. They joined the Lutheran Church. And we need to find ways to make all of our churches broadly and expansively welcoming enough that we begin to invite and bring in the whole of the Hispanic community, so that when we have the recent immigrant, monolingual Spanish, impoverished person who comes to our churches, there is a more diverse place for them to land and a broader and deeper support for them as new people in America, and a place that is diverse Anglo, African American, Latino, Asian, all people all together, all people being one. We're not there. So I hear your question and your concern really deeply, and that's how I respond to it, is to say we have to begin to talk about those issues in a new way, because in about 30 years, if we are not 30 years from now, 30 years down the line, in becoming a church of Hispanic people in the United States, then none of us are going to be here anymore. So we need to encompass and embrace the full community. Later on, I hope you'll be able to answer your question better. Right now, that's the best I can do. You know, we have a whole lot of work to do in that area, but we're at the starting line in a way, and we're stepping out.
Bishop, just so you know, we're at 11:25.
Oh my God. Okay, should we wrap this up?
Yes.
Okay. All right. 2 more questions, Phyllis.
This is not a question, Bishop. This is something that we are going to try to put into practice, and anyone can come with the idea. 2 years ago, Lutheran Church from Boston came down to.
I found it fun, and I'd like to have other people around my age group that I can also talk to.
Excellent. We'll do it. Okay, I see hands, but I think we really need to wrap this up, and so we're going to hear from our guests, and then a few words about how we're going to extend the invitation for these next Indaba conversations, and then we'll eat barbecue. Thank you all. Thank you.
I have to say that following your vision is an incredibly hard act to follow. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Can everyone understand my accent?
No.
It'll probably change at least twice in the 5 minutes I'm going to speak to you. My name is Angharad Parry-Jones. I am from the Church in Wales, but I work in the Anglican Communion Office in London on continuing Indaba. I have had the immense privilege, and that's exactly what it was, to have worked with what we call the pilot project, which is that which Johanna and John was involved in, and to see that develop and to see what's happening next. And that is what you're a part of. This spark of an idea that came from Archbishop Tabo, who's the Archbishop of Cape Town in South Africa, when he was part of the 2008, when people were saying, well, we can't vote on things because we're never going to agree. What are we going to do? Let's have small groups. And Archbishop Tarbo comes in and says, that looks a bit like Indaba. It's this thing we do in South Africa. And so this has been introduced into the communion. It starts off, I'm sure, when Canon Phil Grove spoke to you, I could almost put money on the fact that he will have used his curry analogy, that Indaba at the Lambeth Conference was like his first curry, which was a tin of tomatoes, a tin of beans, and some curry powder. At least that's what curry is in Wales. And so we've been developing what it means to do Indaba across the communion. But there's no way and no point of a couple of people based in London saying, this is what we ought to do, come on, do it. Something quite exciting about what it means to do Indaba is because it's you getting together and deciding we need to do something different. At the very heart of what doing Indaba means is working out how do we talk to one another. Who are we? For me, it's been really exciting to hear what you've been doing as the Diocese of New York, as you work out what it means to be we. Whether it's your two new best pals, or polyamorous relationship, as we suggested from above. But there's also the sense of what does it mean to be we as the Anglican communion. It's this big thing out there that might get mixed up with this horrid idea of Mother Church in Canterbury. I'm Welsh, we're disestablished, so I can take a step away. But what does it mean to be we? What does it mean to be an Anglican communion? What does it mean to be in relationship in a way that, just as here in New York, that when it comes to working out what you're going to do about budgets and churches and buildings, that we've got to be in it together to work it out. There's a real sense in what does it mean to be Anglicans and Episcopalians in a world where we do not agree. What does it mean to be an Episcopalian in a relationship with a church in Nigeria? What do we do about who we are? And so just exactly as you've been working out who we are in the Diocese of New York, people throughout the communion are working out who they are in their diocese. I loved your question about youth. Got very excited. And I'd really love to talk to you afterwards about in more detail about what they're doing in Saldanha Bay in South Africa. Because they've had a youth Indaba, where they brought people together. And I'd love to put you in touch with some people there, if you're interested. The bits in, as I said, I'm from North Wales. I'm from a little village in North Wales. And this is my first real trip to America. I went to Miami when I was 10, but apparently that doesn't count. But on this trip, I'm here to hear from you guys here. I've also been invited to Iowa, and I had a vague idea where New York was. I honestly had to Google to find out where Iowa was. Because they too are trying to work out what it means in a changing world, in a changing diocese. How do we actually talk to one another? How do we know who we are? And then I'm going off to the west coast, to the Diocese of El Camino Real. We're also involved in the pilot project, discovering what it is meant to enable the voices of all those in their diocese. camera, I would love you to come and talk to me, either on your own or in your new little families, about what it's really meant. What's changed? What's excited you about this? What would you want to share with those thinking about doing something similar? So come and talk to me in my camera, and I'll put you on the internet.
Anne-Card has become a cherished friend over the last couple of years. She's my Facebook buddy, my Skype buddy, and occasionally when we find ourselves on the same side of the Atlantic, an in-person buddy. And she arrived yesterday. I picked her up at Kennedy. We got home. She's staying with Tom and me. And then last night we were invited to join the bishop and some others. And she got the New York experience of the horrible subway ride. And she was so tired because she had gotten up really early in the morning to get to the airport. And so I'm glad she's speaking so positively about it. And I want to tell you something else about her. I just asked her if I could do this, and she said it was going to embarrass her. But before she got on that airplane yesterday morning, she was with the, we would call them the Commission on Ministry in the church in Wales, going through a discernment conference. And so I want to solicit your prayers for my friend Anne-Card and the church in Wales. Where we go from here is the next topic. Two things on the less formal side. The bishop said, when it comes to your friendships, do it. The relationships that you've begun to build, we're concluding this Indaba, but that doesn't mean you're concluding your friendships, that you're concluding your relationships. And there's no recipe for how to build a friendship. If I were to come to you and say, okay, here's are the steps you need to take to build your friendship, you would look at me cross-eyed. You figure that out. You stay in touch in the ways that are going to work for you and your Indaba partners. And keep us informed of how that's going. That's the less structured piece of it. The other thing I want to say to you is this Indaba has focused on helping us to become better acquainted within the Diocese of New York. A shared understanding of our common life has been the mantra for this. Indaba is about more than the church. Indaba is also about our communities in which we live. And I can't tell you how to do this because I don't live in all your towns. I don't know who your neighbors are. But I hope you will begin to think about Indaba as a community endeavor. Where are the unfamiliar contexts in your community? Who are the voices in your community that you haven't sat down and had a conversation with? And I don't know how to tell you to do that in your town or in your neighborhood within the city. But just as this has been a transformative experience about how we have become better acquainted and how we understand the different contexts of the Diocese of New York. Indaba can be a tool for you to understand the context of your own community. And I just want to say that to you. and maybe some of you will run with it. And when you do run with it, will you let me know how you're running? Okay. Now, that's the unstructured piece. Here's the structured piece. The bishop said, we want to keep doing this for as long as we need to keep doing this. And we don't know how long that's going to be. But there will be a 2015 Indaba along these same lines. Probably 3 congregations from 3 very different contexts, grouped together to be together on 3 specific weekends. We'll try not to schedule it around the priest conference or somebody's fall festival or whatever, but you know, we'll do the best we can with that. But the same sort of thing, going and spending a weekend, staying overnight. Did you figure out why it was important to stay overnight? Yeah.
You're so tired, you don't want to go anymore.
If you didn't figure out why you needed to stay overnight, you probably need to go back and stay overnight. And so in 2015, we will do another one. And again, the invitation will be extended to every congregation in the diocese. And we will announce that shortly. And I would like to think, I haven't talked with you about this, let's talk. I would like to
Can we talk privately before you come out?
I would like to think that maybe we could, if we announce this, that we could get people to form their teams, and that maybe as part of the diocesan convention, or around the diocesan convention, we could actually form up those teams so that they'd be ready to go in winter, spring, and fall of the next 2015. Okay, CDC. So that would be the 2015 Indaba. However, we also want to do something this year. One of the things that we heard back, especially from some of our smaller congregations, but also because we didn't have as much lead time as we would have hoped, even from some of our bigger congregations, was we just can't get together a team of 4 people. We can't do it on this specific weekend, and so they didn't do it. So we hope this year, between now and November, to roll out 2 Indabas, which will be less structured, less demanding, shorter conversations, but we hope also fruitful conversations, Indaba conversations. One will be for clergy. Clergy, and remember we said for this one, we want you to be a settled priest. We want the rector, we want the priest in charge. This will be for clergy, period. Grouped in... Deacons, yes.
Thank you.
Deacons too. And you can tell me whether you want to be grouped with priests or just with other deacons. You know, we can sort that out. But it will be for clergy, priests and deacons as well. Grouped in 3s, hopefully from very different contexts. I say 3s, the Holy Spirit was so good to us in that we got a multiple of 3 for this Indaba. And she works really well that way, the Holy Spirit, but there may be one group of 4 or something like that if the Holy Spirit says you need to have a group of 4. So there will be a group for clergy, and basically here's what you will be asked to do. It will be a conversation around what the marks of congregational health are. And while there are lots of people who will tell you what the marks of congregational health are, and they will spell it out to you completely, I think it would be better if you talk about what the marks of health are in your congregation. And that out of that, we discover what health looks like in the Diocese of New York. Health in South Fallsburg doesn't look like health at St. James, Manhattan. Okay? So discover what health looks like. And clergy, you will be asked, if you're in a group of 3, you will be asked to pick 3 weekdays when the three of you can get together to go into each setting, go up in the morning, have some conversation about that context, getting to know that church and that community in the morning, have a nice long lunch together, and talk about what the marks of health are in that context, and get feedback, push each other on that, affirm each other, challenge each other on that. That's the structure. Pick the days according to your convenience. We're not going to tell you when to do that. If Monday's your day off, don't do it on a Monday. Okay? So that's one. Second one is for laypersons in the church. Again, grouped in threes or fours, from very different contexts within the diocese. And you will be asked to do this on a Sunday, so that you will be hosting in your congregation on one Sunday, and on the other two you'll be going visiting. And same general topic of conversation. What are the marks of health in this church, in this community, when you go to visit in that place? And do the same thing. Push, affirm, challenge, whatever it looks like. Go to church, be in that setting, worship with that community, and then over a nice long lunch after coffee hour, the eighth sacrament, over a nice long lunch, have that conversation about the marks of congregational health. Some things you can do for you, and we will announce this, and we want you to get back, sign up really quickly about this, so that we can get this underway, and you can have several months between now and November to pick the days when you can go and do that. Who among lay people, because we've got 60-some odd thousand of them, that would be a huge Indaba. Who among lay people are we looking for? Who has priority on this? We will probably set a number for different sizes of congregations. So for a smaller church, maybe we say we want to limit it to 4. For the big churches that have like 9 convention delegates, we may do, say, your max would be 12 or whatever. There will be something that we arrive at. Here's who has priority. You. The people who have already done an Indaba. We want you to continue to build on this experience that you've had. Wardens, treasurers, diocesan convention delegates. Secondarily to those folks, vestry members. And we might also expand that to key lay leaders in your congregations. If it gets to that, we're going to probably sort of want to know, why are you choosing this person who doesn't hold some office in your church? But we will come up with that. The other thing I want to say, thank you for saying what you did about young people. Young people are priority. And hear me now. If you give us young adults who will do this Indaba, then the Holy Spirit is going to give us a young adult Indaba as part of this. But you've got to give us those young adults. And you will remember, we asked for a young adult in this Indaba. And so, heard you loud and clear. It's on the plan. Okay? And you can help me with it. Yes?
With regards to youth, I think some of the reason that youth didn't attend, A, because they're outside activities, but B, youth needs youth to work within a group.
Yeah.
So maybe youth can be intimidated by the amount of adults that were in congregations.
So we'll do, when we send this out, we may say, is this person a diocesan convention delegate, a warden, a treasurer. You know, I don't know. We'll look at how we group people, but for sure, I heard you loud and clear about the young adult thing, and we want to honor that.
No, he said you.
You.
To talk with other youth.
Talk with.
I was looking for a youth endowment.
Okay, we'll do youth then. We'll have to figure out how that works in terms of getting people back and forth. Parents may have to go and hang somewhere to get the youth back and forth, but we can do that. So that's the plan. The other things you can do from the word go once you sign up, start praying for the people who are going to become your friends that you don't know yet. Start thinking about what it is that you want to show them about your congregation and your community. And start thinking about what the marks of health are in your community. Those are things that you can do. And you can also do the thing that some of you did, where when your Indaba visitors come and you're hosting, give them something to take home, some sign of what your church is, the ubiquitous church coffee mug or whatever. So that's the plan. Does it sound like a good plan? Okay. Yes.
I just want to put in a plug as to how important this is. Phil doesn't know what I'm going to say, but in the convention planning, we're trying to support this process. So to the extent that you respond to this invitation from the Archdeacon and get feedback back to the Archdeacon and the Bishop, we will be able to support this in our programs at convention. So when he keeps mentioning the November date, we want to make sure that we are able to support this process and bring other people into the Indaba process. But we're going to need, in this short window, your feedback and your participation in a very forthwith way, so that we have enough lead time to make sure that this is the most productive and powerful at convention to expand it to other people. So that's my plug-in to please do this and get the information back so that we can build convention around it.
We'll get the word out fast, get on the stick and respond, okay? There was a question back here and then I'll get you. Did you have a question or comment?
I just wanted to say something about the youth though, just in terms of it is possible. We have a 16-year-old in our Indaba. You can make it work, and I hereby volunteer to help you do that.
Cool, great, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
On the subject of feedback, it would be wonderful, I think, if we could share the feedback collectively that you own, so to speak. In other words, I guess I'm only speaking for our group, but would it not be helpful to all of us if we knew something about the recommendations and experiences, because it must be a treasure trove. Right.
John
and
Johanna and I already have a meeting scheduled in the next couple of weeks because our summer project is going to be to not just write this up, but some of those photos that you sent in, to put this in some kind of format so that it will be available not only to the Diocese of New York, but also to the communion. To say, here's what this first New York Indaba looks like. What we heard from you, some of those comments that you sent back in, the photos, Angarad and Phil are producing a video that will be about Indaba communion-wide, and we'll be a part of that as well. So I hope you will see those reflections coming out of this little summer project that John and Johanna and I
eagerly awaited.
Got it. Okay, it's 6 minutes till 12. Are we good?